Frameworks. 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 Frameworks.
I'm Andy, Odyssey Recordings. Welcome to this tutorial that I've entitled Frameworks. By frameworks, I'm referring to the two-step, kick and snare, and of course hats, that will form the backbone of any drum and bass tune that you produce. If we take a little time to look at this historically, and I don't want to use too much time up on this because of course we want to get on to building two-step breaks, but I think it is important to see where the two-step came from and how it massively impacted the musical face, the landscape of drum and bass. Before the emergence of the two-step break, drum and bass had grown from this cradle of the acid house parties, the warehouse raves. Now, the thing about the warehouse raves is they'd taken music from the United States, they'd taken Detroit techno, they'd taken acid house out of Chicago, they'd taken US garage from New York, all these different sounds, and they just played them in a melting pot, which was really exciting because you got to hear lots of different music under one roof. London in particular had a big fascination with hip hop and street beats and electro, big beat soul. This is why Soul to Soul did so well and music like it. Bristol also. That's got something to do with the big Afro-Caribbean and black African populations, particularly in South London, in Bristol, in other places, that had a big influence on the music. So it wasn't just garage or techno or acid house anymore. It was now garage mixed with acid house, mixed with techno, but with a breakbeat focus as well. And over time, as we moved into the era of rave and hardcore, and then on to jungle techno, which just became jungle, and then finally onto drum and bass, the music shed the 4 to the floor. And for those of you who don't know what 4 to the floor is, it's that simple heartbeat that runs through most house and garage and techno that just goes 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like a heartbeat, a pulse. Now, our rave music shed that, as I said, like a skin off a snake, in favour of far more breakbeat focused music. Drawing now exclusively from the famous catalogue of breakbeats from well-known funk records, just the same as the hip-hop artists did, rave artists, jungle artists, drum and bass artists, whichever era you're looking at, came across an interesting problem. You see, at this stage, the technology didn't really exist to separate pitch and speed. And as the energy, and this is partially due to the consumption of narcotics at the raves, as the energy increased and therefore the speed increased in the records that were produced throughout 91, 92 and into 93 and 94, we came across an interesting problem in using breaks. By that I mean the bass, the kick, disappears as you pitch breaks up and up and up in speed. Now, to demonstrate this principle, I've chosen 4 very well-known breaks. And it would be remiss of me not to start, of course, with the Amen Brother break by the Winstons. Now, at its original tempo, it sounds like this. What a track, no wonder it's the favourite. But at drum and bass speed, or jungle speed, it sounds like this. Now there's a big difference between the two. In its original form, it's just huge. It's crash orientated, but there's plenty of bottom end and fatness to it. But at the faster speed, that bottom end has disappeared, and whilst the energy remains from all the crash cymbals and the atmospherics, the bottom end is completely gone. This is even more noticeable with the next break I've selected, Hot Pants, I'm Coming, by the JBs, which we sometimes call Snatch. It was a big favourite by hip house artists, and the reason for that is the mixture of a good fat kick and racy tambourine work and this fantastic sharp metallic snare, as you're going to hear. Wow. At the higher speed, you're going to draw it for drum and bass. It sounds like this. That snare still has that wonderful metallic edge. The hats are unbelievably sharp. They're razor blade sharp. But again, the bottom end, it's not there anymore. It's a poop rather than a boom. Apache, the incredible bongo band. Dark, murky whirlwind of bongo and conga work. Absolutely fantastic. Loads of bottom end to that. For a drum and bass artist, all the curls of the bongos are almost improved, if you dare say that. They're drier as well. But again, the bottom end is now gone. And finally, Soul Pride by James Brown. In its original form. What an incredible break, full of rolls and intricacies, full of ghosts on the snares, leading up to crashes, full of surprises. And actually famously hard to engineer with, simply because it's not 100% of time. I'll do a separate tutorial on use of breaks, and this is something that we'll deal with, this manipulation of what is effectively a live drummer with human error brought into dance music where you need to be perfectly in time for the sake of the DJ. But that's a separate tutorial for a separate day. But suffice to say, at drum and bass speed, all the intricacies remain, the snare slaps you about, the rolls are fantastic. The bottom end entirely gone. It was never the bassiest break to start with anyway, and it will sound like this. So there you have it, 4 of the most famous breaks, first in their full fat, full milk, and then skimmed, ready for the drum and bass producer. Jungle artists, when they were using these breaks, relied on the sub bass to provide all the bottom end, and these breaks just skittered about, but with no real genuine heartbeat or substance. That had been left at the door when we got rid of the 4th floor. Until 1995, when a track came out, it changed the face of drum and bass forever. Let's look at exactly how Alex Reese made this break. So you have a kick on the first beat of the bar, a snare on the second, nothing on the third itself, but halfway on its way to the 4th, you have another kick, and then your second snare comes on the 4th beat of the bar here. So effectively, if you want that in numbers, it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, kick, snare, rest, kick, snare. If you want that in musical terminology, it's a crotchet kick or a quarter note. It's a crotchet snare or quarter note. It's an 8th note or quaver rest. It's an 8th note or quaver kick followed by a crotchet or quarter note snare. And it sounds like this. When the the Metalheadz label released Alex Reese's Pulp Fiction in 1995, I'm sure none of us really cottoned on to just exactly how pivotal a track it was. It was a great track, and it sounded different to the others, sure. But did we know we were staring the future of drum and bass in the face? I'm not entirely sure. And did future drum and bass artists realise that that was going to be their template for a break building? Probably not. Nonetheless, as time wore on, more and more artists, more and more releases that came, featured this sparse, stripped back kick and snare, now effectively giving drum and bass and jungle back what they'd left behind when they stopped using the 4/floor. A new identity as well, because it wasn't 4/floor, it was something new, but it had all the benefits of 4/floor. The heartbeat of the kick was back in. The next track that I became aware of that did a similar thing, that stripped out breaks in favour of a sparse kick and snare, just came barely a year later in '96, and that was Nasty Habits, Shadowboxing on 31 Records. Now let's look at the difference, and it is a very subtle one, between the two-step patterns of Pulp Fiction and the two-step patterns of Shadowboxing. To change the original Pulp Fiction step pattern into the shadowboxing step pattern is very simple. You take the snare that lies on the 4th beat of the bar and you move it in between, so it now comes on the and of 4. So it's now kick, snare, rest, kick, rest, snare, and the result is this. You can hear on the 4th beat how it just simplifies down into the Pulp Fiction version. And you can also notice that that particular pattern has a little bit of a bounce to it that maybe the Pulp Fiction doesn't. The Pulp Fiction version is a bit more stable, and yet the shadowboxing one has just a little bit more bounce back and forth by having that late snare. Let's return to the Pulp Fiction two-step pattern for a moment. So we're back to going kick, snare, rest, kick, snare. The first thing I want to look at is adding an extra kick, and this kick comes just before the 3rd beat. So there's now an extra one just before the 3rd beat. Now, the effect of this is to drive the two-step harder with that extra kick. The next variation is to remove the original 2nd kick and just leave the new one that we've put. Now this enables the two-step to lurch. It's quite a jumpy pattern. I like this one. Another one that I really like is where the 2nd kick comes earlier. It comes on the and of 2 here, just after the 1st snare, and then the 2nd snare comes early as well, where the old kick used to come on the and of 3. As you can see, this has a bit of more rocking side to side action, and also it leaves a large amount of space here. This entire 4 beat is empty now. In fact, from the time that you hear the strike of the 2nd snare halfway through the 3rd beat, there's nothing more. Now if you want to fill that space in terms of kick and snare, and let's just do it to the last one, we'll add one extra kick on the 4th beat of the last bar out of 4. that has the effect of dropping you back in to the pattern. Another variation of this is to move the snare, the second snare, back to its original place on the 4th beat of the bar. And if I'm doing that, I'm not going to have that final kick. I like this one because it leaves some space all across the 3rd beat of the bar, as you can see. The benefit of having the snare back on the 2 and the 4 is, as most tracks tend to favour the original Pulp Fiction template or variations of it, you don't get the clash of a double snare here. The one thing that you're going to come across with changing the snares out of the 2 and the 4 placement is that it might be mixed with a record that still keeps the snares on their 2 and 4 placements, and there you get double snare hits. It's beginning to sound just a little bit busy perhaps. Here we also have the option to add a 3rd kick in the bar. And I'm adding it here, again, where the original was. So now you've got a kick on the 1, a snare on the 2, a kick on the and a 2, a kick on the and a 3 in its original placement, and the snare on the 4 in its original placement also. And the effect of that is this. Ultimately, the lovely thing about making music is you, the producer, have freedom of choice. It's entirely up to you how you arrange your kicks and snares. And as it's likely this is the first part of the track you'll build, just bear in mind that it will influence the other decisions you make in terms of bass lines and samples and addition of further percussion and breaks to fill out the tune. You can make the kick and snare patterns really busy if you so choose. My one word of warning, if you do this, you limit the space that you have for other things to come through, for other elements to come through, for other percussion to come through. This is one example of a busier, more aggressive kick and snare pattern, which we can take a look at. I'll play you it first and then we'll draw in and we'll have a look at how it's built. I remember some records coming out on Renegade Hardware sort of some 5-6 years ago employing this pattern. Let's have a look at how that one works, just as a token gesture at a more complex pattern. So now there's an extra level of complexity to the placement. I've got a kick on the 1 and I've also got a second kick to drive just before the second beat hits. The first snare comes late, if you want to call it late, on the and of 2. Just after, so this is like a semi-quaver in to the 3rd beat, I got my 3rd kick. On the 4, I've got my traditional snare, and then just clipping before the beat, I've got a kick. I don't know if you can pick out that because the length of it might on the screen look like it's bled. Let me just shorten that so you can see where that placement is. Yeah, there you go. So it's just before and then the bar starts again. For a little variation on every other pattern, I've also put a snare just at the very end. And I'll shorten the one before it so you can see that. There you go, you can isolate that. And let me also shorten this one so you can really visually see it. In fact, let's do ourselves a favour and zoom in a little bit. So I'm now just taking just 2 bars, not 4. So you can see this a little better. So you got kick, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, 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 snare, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, kick, snare. So it's like a real bounce between the kick and snare at the end of the 2-beat pattern. Now seems to be as good a time as any to talk about hats, which are the third component of a two-step break. The kick and snare providing the framework, and the hats then filling and giving you the energy. I think the first mistake that people make with hats when they first start to produce is to not understand how hats work. Now that sounds like a bit of a crazy statement to make, and please don't be insulted if you're a new producer and you're new to this and you're coming to the world of hi-hats. The thing is, you have to think like a drummer, and not all of us are drummers. I'm not a drummer myself. I happen to have a very good friend who is a drummer though, and I've learned a thing or two from him. Here's the thing, imagine you are a drummer and you're sat at a drum kit. Well, you're going to kick the kick as hard as you can. You're going to wallop the snare as hard as you can. But realistically, the right arm that's producing the hats isn't going to hit the hat, not at that speed, just as hard all the time. That's just not natural, it's not really even physically possible. I mean, I'm going to look like a bit of an idiot doing this, but I'll do it for the benefit of you. You're not going to go ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. It's like a machine gun, it's not realistic. That's not how people use hi-hats. Tap-ta-tap-ta-tap-ta-tap-ta. Hopefully you can pick up that the 1, 2, 3, 4 are marked out and emphasized above and beyond the guys that lie in between. So, effectively you're going strong weak, strong weak, strong weak, strong weak. That's more natural. And if you start to program your hats like that, there'll be a subtle difference. Well, actually there'll be more than a subtle difference, there'll be a big difference. Maybe not one that you can put your finger on if you don't know what you're listening for, but for those of us in the know, and that now includes you, the difference is poignant. Here are hats isolated, all at the same volume. It sounds fake, it's plasticky. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. It's the wrong way to use them. Let's look at a pattern of hats. So here is just 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Just quaver hats, or eights we call them. Now at the moment they're all the same volume. And you can see that because helpfully it's colour coordinated on an arranging screen, and they're all nice angry red. Now, if I take the second one, and the fourth one, and the sixth one, and the eighth one, and I get my velocity tool, and I pull them down in volume, and I'm going to do it fairly noticeably. So they're now a cooler shade of green. Hopefully you can hear, and I've left actually the remaining 3 bars of the pattern with that angry machine gun style hat. So now we've got the more realistic hats of strong weak, strong weak, strong weak, strong weak, then strong, 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 strong. I can't say that quick enough, but you get the idea. By contrast, you should be able to hear the difference, and actually you can go a stage further and understand that the very first one will be the strongest. Even the other ones of the bar are not quite as strong. So pull them back just a shade as well. Not much. And if you really want to get into the complexity of it, strongest, slightly weaker, slightly stronger but not as strong as the first, and then the weakest of the bunch here, and then you do the same for these. So the ghost after it is weak, the ghost after this is weaker still, this guy's almost back to normal weakness, and this one's the weakest of them all. So that will be even more realistic. And now hopefully you can really tell the difference when those machine gun hats that haven't been treated come in. So I'm going to give us half good hats that have been treated velocity wise, and then half machine gun hats, and you should really be able to pick out the difference. and let's nestle that underneath our two-step pattern that we built earlier. Now actually, I've just done a brand new version. Let's zoom back out a little bit, just for an extra little bonus pattern. Now in this pattern, this is widely used as well. It's a way of getting the pattern to continue across 2 bars. So now, and all that's happened is from the original Pulp Fiction version, this kick that usually comes on the strong first beat of the bar has moved just halfway across the beat. So it's now on the end of 1. So you get kick, snare, rest, kick, snare, rest, kick, snare, rest, kick, snare. So it goes across 2 bars now. And the effect is this. Let's remove this extra one at the end as well, so you can really hear it. And hopefully you're picking up on the difference between where it passes through these first 2 bars where the hats have been engineered properly, in inverted commas, and the second where they have been untouched and they're just all the same volume and sound, if you will agree with me I suppose, a little bit fake, a little bit plasticky. So let's get rid of those plastic hats, don't like them. Let's take the engineered volume hats only, and here we go. A nice crisp 2-step break, kicks and snares, engineered hats, ready to go. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial on the 2-step break, and by all means comment underneath and let me know what kind of patterns you come up with. Be interesting to see how your track develops off this initial framework. A couple of things I want to add to close. The first is a little debate that I've come across about what kicks and what snares you should use and what hats you should use. The first thing that I'm going to say, and I'm probably going to go against the grain a little here, but it's probably because of the heritage I have in producing house music as well as drum and bass music. And there's a little bit of science behind this. Your rib cage responds to 80 Hertz. That's what your rib cage responds to. That thump in the chest that you get in a nightclub, that is at 80 Hertz. Now, a lot of drum and bass producers will talk about, oh, you don't want the kick to interfere with your bass work, so bring it up to 200 Hertz, have it around there. To me, that's almost removing the effect of the kick. It's turning what should be a thump and a heartbeat into a pop. For me, that's not how I want my kicks to act. I want them to be a heartbeat. House music relies on that, and of course house music has bass. Techno relies on that, and techno has bass, so why shouldn't drum and bass rely on that also? Take it from me, trust me in this, that 80 Hertz is the perfect peak for a kick drum. Now, sub bass is going to lie beneath that, 30, 40, 50 Hertz, so you're not really going to interfere with that unless you make your kick too boomy. That I will acquiesce you don't want to do. Similarly, any kind of synth bass, any sort of distorted, tearing sort of bass sounds that you're going to use are going to be way up and above beyond. So they're going to have frequencies from sort of like 100, 150 right up into the 1000 mark. So I wouldn't worry about them either. So 80 Hertz is good. I have to say, if you don't want things to interfere sonically, there's other ways to do it. Panning is one way, compression is another, so we can talk about that separately. Snares and kicks and hats all come down to taste. One producer will favour a nice dull thud, another wants a really sonically boing kind of kick, whereas another producer wants a really distorted kick. It's okay. Choose your own. Snares. Maybe a sharp metallic snare. Next guy is going to choose just a clap, but the next guy is going to choose a really boxy, big, beefy, real sounding snare. Again, it's down to taste. And for hats, you might want to play around with some VST plugins that actually have real hats, things like Superior Drummer, Artist Drums, etc., rather than drum machine hats. These will give you even more character depending on how hard or soft you hit them. With giga sampling, now instruments are sampled multiple times over at different velocities, and with real drums, things change as you hit them harder. If you kick a kick really hard, you know, it has a very different sound to the woolly warmth of just beating it softly. And you can change between felt or plastic kickers. You have the ability to change between drumsticks or rods or brushes. So all of these can make a massive difference. Hey, in the words of Duke Ellington, the great jazz maestro, if it sounds right, it is right. From me, Andy at Odyssey Recordings, I'll see you next time.
Frameworks. 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 Frameworks.